narratives that look like failures from the perspective of the hero's journey, because the heroine or the hero hasn't gained the world, isn't king of the universe, hasn't cut the heads off a whole bunch of dragons. Those are the ones that much more realistically reflect women's lives, as well as many men's lives.
Across the globe, storytellers are flipping the script. In books, in film, in TV, theatre and art. I'm Kimberley Lipschus, and this is The Storymakers Rebellion, a podcast about the rule breakers, trailblazers and visionaries who are shaping stories on their own terms. I'm beyond thrilled today to have Dr. Sharon Blackie as my guest. Sharon is a mythologist, a psychologist, a best-selling author. She lectures around the world, and her work weaves together the threads of mythic imagination, landscape, myth, fairy tale, and how all this shapes us, especially in times such as we face today. She is a most rebellious story weaver, and her books, Women Rose-Rooted, Haggitude, amongst others, have jettisoned Sharon to be the guiding voice for women reclaiming soul, story and belonging. Not to mention, she has become a beacon of hope for women navigating midlife. Dr. Sharon Blackie, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
I'm very grateful for the invitation. Looking forward to the conversation.
So for those in our audience who don't know your work, could you start by sharing where you are today and what was the spark that got you into mythology and storytelling, particularly from a feminine lens?
Yeah, I'm in the north of England, not too far actually from where I grew up, and I've circled round several decades later back here. Myth and story, fairy tales, folklore, all of that malarkey is something that I have been working with and enjoying ever since I was a child. But it was really when I was practicing psychology, I suppose, that it took a hold of me as a kind of solution for many of the issues that we grapple with, and particularly because of the very strong female role models that we see in native European myth and folklore. And I only ever work with my own European myth and folklore because I'm very conscious of the fact that that's what I understand, that I understand the context and the social context and the historical context. And so I tend to stick very closely to that.
And you've been quite generous in talking about your past and the mother wound. Was it something that you felt even as a child?
Yeah, I was presented with fairy tales as a very small child, and the reason that I loved them wasn't so much a function of the fact that, they're escapist stories in many ways. So I wasn't really reading them for escape. I was reading them because I saw all of these wonderfully strong heroines who started off in impossible situations and managed to find a way out of them, not only through their own ability and skills and qualities of character, but by kind of creating alliances and community with the people that they met. And I thought that was just magical. If they could find their way out of that kind of situation, then surely I could get through the day.
They are magical in that way, and I think that's why it appeals to so many people. If we just jump way forward in life, what happened in midlife for you? Was there a change in trajectory? And I know we have many turning points in our lives, but midlife you've written about a lot. I'd love you to speak into that.
Yeah, I mean, I had about 3 midlife crises beginning in my mid-30s, and they just kept coming. And I think that was because I hadn't addressed the stuff that I needed to address in the first one or two. But for me, what I felt at midlife was very strongly that I needed some kind of inspiration for the second half of my life. And I wasn't getting it from the kind of overculture, if you like, where we were all being told, and women much more than men, that the second half of life we're kind of finished. We're not fertile anymore. We're not useful for anything very much anymore. We'd best just go and sit in a corner and be invisible. And I didn't really feel that I wanted to do that. So because I've been so embroiled in myth and fairy tales, as always, when the culture doesn't provide us with good stories and role models, my inclination is always to go back and look at the old stories because our ancestors knew some stuff that we didn't. We know some stuff that they didn't, but there's a lot of wisdom there. And I embarked on a kind of long, very long, really, research program to look for inspiration in European myths and fairy tales to see if I could find older woman characters who were inspiring and might offer me some clues about the possibilities for the second half of life. But midlife itself, I always think of as when we talk about menopause, it is a pause between the story of the first half of our lives, which is one journey that's very much more outward focused, about how we face up to the world, perhaps more heroic in nature. And then the journey of the second half of our lives, which is more inward focused. It's a kind of spiritual journey, often, even though a lot of people don't like that word. It's about purpose and meaning and what on earth we're supposed to be doing here. So I was looking for something also that reflected that time of pause and uncertainty, and that time when everything feels as if it's being stripped away.
As you said, you were looking at fairy tales because you weren't seeing it reflected anywhere else as a way to map your journey. And yet it's a menopause, but it's very internal. And yet in popular culture, we see the hero's journey as external, and we don't see that as a worthy place to dig, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right. The hero's journey, it's not only outward focused, but it's action focused. It's very much about doing. And if you think of the first half of our lives, it is very much about doing. It's about creating a kind of persona to face up to the world. It's about building whatever it might be, a profession or a family or a home. It's about constructing an outward facing life. And it's not that inner stuff isn't going on, of course it is, but it is, but we are there to kind of find our place in the world. And, fairy tales do have a lot of that. I mean, the heroine is trying to find her place in the world. But as she's doing it, she's also growing and transforming and learning about community and learning about how to use her own unique strengths, her own unique character. And I think for all of us in the second half of life, um, it's about recognizing our own unique gifts, just kind of like the fairy tale heroine does. I mean, some of them are very feisty, some of them are courageous, some of them are just great community builders. They all have different strengths that get them through the journey. And I think that's really what the second half of life is about. It's about consolidation in a sense, but it's also about putting those gifts out, those unique qualities that we have out into the world in service of it.
If we turn to the fairy tales themselves and myths, where do they come from? Like, I know they're part of ancient culture, but it's your work is very much older than the Grimm or the Disney. But where do they originate from?
Well, they're both different. So myths are very top down. Okay, so they come from the kind of hierarchy, from the priestly caste or the king, from the ruler. The myths tell us how the world is, how it came into being, and what our place is supposed to be in it. Myths kind of tell us, where we fit in, and the best myths tell us a little bit of something about why we're here. Whereas folklore and fairy tales are a subset of folk tales. Folklore Folktales come from the bottom up. So they come from the folk, kind of by definition. And fairy tales in particular have been shown to be very much the province of women in most cases, not exclusively, but in most cases, women would tell these stories to each other while they were doing domestic work. They would teach them to their daughters. You know, I always think as just evidence that, life can be really, really, really hard, but hey, there's always a way out. And so they're very much the stories of the people. They reflect the lives of the people, and they reflect the challenges that particularly working class people, would find in their lives. So they have a very, very different function. And yeah, they began to be written down mostly, but again, not exclusively, by male folktale collectors in around the 1800s. But of course, they'd been in the oral tradition for centuries, possibly some of them millennia before then.
It's interesting that the males decided to write them down, I guess, before they weren't seen in the patriarchy as important, which they very much are.
Yeah, I mean, I think previously they had been thought to be just like women's stuff, not worthy of collection, not worthy of being thought about. But particularly when the Romantic movement started to be very strong in Europe, the Romantic poets, particularly in England and in Germany, where there were big Romantic movements, that was kind of a reaction against industrialization and rationalization and the Enlightenment. And they began to be taken more seriously then. I should say that in some places, particularly Ireland and Italy, there were very well-known female collectors of folk tales who wrote them down. But a lot of the fact that it was male was just social convention at the time. Women weren't allowed out very much in some places.
So, in terms of the path of individuation and fairy tales and what they offer, and kind of hooking back into the way they were taught to women, today in our world, with everything that's going on, do you think that it would be worthy for us to learn more about fairy tales and myths and the stages in particular for personal as well as writers and creatives?
Yes, I mean, I write fiction myself, but I'm interested in the way that fairy tales help us grow. I am a psychologist originally by training, so how they help us um, understand the different things that are happening in our lives, how they help us to understand the qualities that actually will make us kind of successful in the world. I don't mean in an outward way, I mean that will help us to thrive in our lives. And to me, the kind of information that's embedded in these stories is more relevant than ever because, again, these are stories. Excuse me, these are stories that begin in challenging times, and we're in challenging times, and they tell us how to navigate challenging times. So there's that. And also just the images, the beauty of the images in fairy tales, which really stick with us and kind of go to work on us in ways that are very difficult to kind of intellectualize about, but seem somehow just to illuminate the nature of life, the nature of the world around us.
And if we look at one of the stages, one of the key stages of fairy tales that I have learnt from you is the loss of family and home. Could you maybe broaden into that stage a little bit from what it would mean for someone's personal development when they examine loss of family and home, but also if they were going to do that when they were going to write a story or a script or use it in art?
Yeah, every fairy tale begins with some kind of big lack. Lack of a mother is often the driving force for a fairy tale heroine. And something happens in her life. It's kind of like the classic hero's journey kind of call to adventure that Joseph Campbell described. Something happens so that she has to leave home. She's forced to leave home. Sometimes she leaves home voluntarily, but rarely. Normally, it's some kind of catastrophe that springs from that lack. And so that's where the journey begins. You've got to find your way out of your comfort zone. You've got to you've got to leave home. You've got to start off on your own, following your own path. And it isn't always comfortable, the process that sets you off on that journey. I think the only other thing that I would add is that um, although part of the journey for the heroine is very much about building community, and that's the community not only of humans, but of animals, birds, trees, plants, the entire natural world is kind of embroiled in that journey. Nevertheless, it has to begin with her. She has to leave the supporting structures behind and just kind of take that step out into the unknown. And I think we all have to do that, not only when we're young and we're kind of like leaving home to go to university or for our first job or to get married, but at other times in our lives too. We've spoken about midlife, and that's another point where something has to be left behind. Something. Not necessarily home, but something. And so it's always a question of these supporting structures falling away. Whatever you thought had defined you up until that point are beginning to fade and to vanish.
So a lot of women are in their midlife. So they're feeling stripped away, they're feeling flailed, the structure's falling away, and there is nothing to navigate that. I mean, it's getting more and more popular, midlife and menopause, but have you seen a growth in your audiences, especially when you wrote Haggitude?
I would say that coincidentally, at the point that I wrote Haggitude, so it was published around about 2022, certainly here in the UK, and I think to an extent in the States as well. I don't know about your part of the world, but there was a sudden burgeoning of conversations around menopause. I don't know how that happened, but it began to happen, and women were talking about it, sometimes for the first time. But often what was happening out there in the culture is that what women were being fed was the idea that this is a time that's very empowering. This is a time where, you can hold on to everything. You can still be young and beautiful and have the body and the clothes and all of the rest of it. And I felt very strongly that that was the wrong message. It's not that we shouldn't take care of ourselves still and going to care what we look like if that matters to us. But that's not the menopause journey. That's not the midlife journey. The midlife journey, the menopause journey is an internal journey. It's about asking why we are here and what is the unique gift that we bring to the world. And it's time to work on that and to get it out there and to use it. So I think for me, yes, there were lots of conversations happening. I didn't necessarily think they were the right ones, and so I decided to dive in with this whole kind of this whole idea that really, no, it's supposed to be a falling away. It's supposed to be a shift. You come out of it different. It's the caterpillar to the butterfly phenomenon. It's supposed to be a whole different part of our lives, and we're not taught about that. We're not taught to expect that. We're not told that it's a thing. And so women are kind of stumbling blindly through midlife without any signposts. And I thought that was a pity.
And if I think about that, not just personally, but for people who are writing stories, when things are falling away to a character or a protagonist that you're writing, how can you write about it if you haven't experienced it yourself? And we are obsessed with productivity. We're youth obsessed. I mean, what my question is what do we lose personally and collectively when we fail to access the empowerment of this life stage?
I think we lose a particular perspective and a particular form of wisdom that women have at midlife and in the second half of life, which is deeply embodied, but which recognizes that a lot of the things that we hold very tight to when we're young aren't necessarily either the ones that matter or the ones that should matter forever. So we've gone through the stage of thinking that appearances are everything. We've gone through the stage of thinking that status, perhaps, is everything, depending on what your particular um, penchant is for these things. And we've gone through the stage of thinking that taking care of everyone else, being nice, being nurturing, is the only thing that women do. Now, I'm not in any way saying that that shouldn't be what women do. It's who we are. But there comes a point in midlife where the hormone, where estrogen and what have you is falling away. And those are the hormones that keep us nurturing and nourishing. And they're going. And, being nice is no longer our only life goal. That's not to say you have to be horrible, but it's just like, no, something is shifting internally. So we lose that sense of focused wisdom and a focus on our own unique gift in the world. So Haggitude was a book title that I just kind of imagined based around the word hag. Now, not everybody loves that word, and I understand why. But when you look at the women in the old stories who are described as hags, and they're everything from midlife through to kind of very old age, these are women who are in the story for themselves. Okay, they're not in the story because they're someone's mother or someone's daughter, or someone's wife. They might be someone's mother or daughter or wife, but that's not why they're in the story. They're in the story for themselves. They're in the story because they have something unique to offer. They've got a strength, they've got an integrity, they've got a wisdom, they've got the ability to see the big picture. And if we insist on keeping um, midlife and menopausal women infantilized, we're never going to get to that stage where we've got a whole cohort of very wonderful, wise women who can be out there, A, helping the young ones get their act together, and B, contributing to society in whatever ways we feel we can.
as opposed to the hag or the temptress in the hero's journey to take you off the journey. They've got so much more function according to what everything you've written about. Is that right?
For sure. I mean, Joseph Campbell, who was the one who first came up with the hero's journey, in several places minimized the role of women um, in the context of the journey and said that either that women don't need to make the journey, or women are the place that the hero gets to, or women just have a very limited function. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think that perhaps our journey is different from the hero's journey. Perhaps it's different at different times of our lives. As I said, in many ways, the first half of our lives is a bit more heroic, whether you're a male or a female, in the sense that it is outward focused, it's a bit more action focused. It's very much about how we present ourselves to the world. But then what I have spoken about as the kind of post heroic journey is something that we come to in the first half of our lives, and that many of us actually, a journey that many, many women take for all of their lives. It's not so outward focused, it's much more community driven, it's much more relational. And a lot of these old stories with women as the key protagonists are not in the least bit heroic. They never were. A lot of the stories, actually, with male protagonists that are classified as heroic actually aren't. We're looking at everything through this heroic lens because that's how we've been taught to see. We've been told that the hero archetype is the archetype that we should all aspire to. And it's not actually. It's an inflation of that archetype. There are lots of other ways of being in a story.
I guess it's become the dominant paradigm, and that equates strength with the outward focus, and strengths could mean so many different things.
And also highly individualistic. I mean, the way that the hero's journey has been applied, whether Campbell intended it to be or not, the way that it's been applied over the last few decades is very much about an individual kind of search for glory. A good hero has to be exceptional in some way. It can't just be some bloke. It has to be someone who is in some way superior to everybody else. And I don't like that, but that's what these heroic journeys, these heroic stories are telling us is the way to be. And I don't think that serves very many men. I mean, most of the men I know are not like that. They don't want that, but that's what's being held up to them as this thing that they should aspire to. So it's very individualistic. It's not about community, it's about your individual glory. It is very tied to the whole myth of progress. That every generation must have more than the generation before, that we must always have more, more, more of everything. And look at the planet as a consequence. That's going well, isn't it? So, it's just all about this mad stuff that we have been doing for decades that is now, falling into the ground all around us. And we need to stop with these stories. We need to go back to the old stories, fairy tales which are not about individualism, they're about community. I mean, yes, you as an individual grow, but it's not all about you. It's no good if you succeed while, a tree is felled or the birds go hungry or whatever it might be. And these old stories tell us the consequences of taking too much. They don't tell us we must always have more. They tell us what happens if we're greedy and if we don't honor and respect the earth. So that the stories have always been there. It's just that we haven't looked at them in that way because we've been so obsessed with the heroic and the individualistic and the myth of more.
And is that the post-heroic journey that you've written about before?
Yeah, and really, you can argue that it's pre-heroic, that it has always been there. There have always been hero tales. The sagas of the warriors in Greece and in Ireland and whatever. There have always been hero tales because there have always been heroes. But there have also always been other people who were the majority, who and certainly just the kind of ordinary people like most of us are, who are looking for different ways of being in the world. And most of our mythology, the Grail mythology, for example, Joseph Campbell portrayed that as a kind of heroic quest for the Grail. It's not really. When you look at, I have a background in scholarly studies of this kind of stuff, and it's all about women. Women are the Grail bearers. It's all about nourishing, and it's all about compassion. What wins the hero, the Grail, at the end of the day, isn't chopping off the head of a dragon or his prowess in battle. It's asking a wounded king what ails him. It's a compassionate question. But we're seeing it through this mad lens of the heroic, and we're not even looking. They've always been there, those stories. We have just not wanted really to hear that.
But you've said that that's how it dominates the stories, it dominates our screens, it dominates a lot of books. But it doesn't fit for women and gender diverse creators. It barely resonates at all. And it feels outdated, it feels offensive. So, how can we write stories that upheld what is broken, that return to serve our communities and make them seem relevant to the people who hold the purse strings?
I think what you have to ask, really, it's a complicated question, but I think the first thing that you have to ask is, what's the driver for the story? It's as simple as that. If the driver for the story is individual glory and success, kind of winner takes all, um, if it's about the protagonist having more of everything, then it's the same old stuff. It's what Hollywood has been churning out for ages, and you can tell that people are tired of it. You can tell that people just want something different. And I
You and
think,
I can tell, but I don't know if the
well,
people holding the purse strings can tell.
I guess it depends. Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how successful they are when they churn out more of this stuff. But I think some of the most interesting movies, some of the most interesting novels, or other works of fiction, drama, or what have you that we've seen over the past few decades are ones that take a slightly different perspective, ones that have a little bit more depth, ones that are about community building. Let's just take a novel from a particular protagonist's point of view, however that works. So it's got to be something about that person. You've got to change, you've got to grow. You've got that kind of arc, you've got that character arc, which is always going to be important. But it's how you achieve your goal. And if you go back to the fairy tales again, just to stress this, a fairy tale heroine never achieves her goals alone. Never. I don't know a fairy tale where she's not helped, where it doesn't matter how she treats others, where the qualities of doing the work, of being courageous and brave, of being clever, sometimes of being funny, always come into it. And so I suppose it depends what the driver of the narrative is. And it's very easy to make it an action oriented, linear, kind of, that's my goal. Now, how do I get to it, no matter who falls by the wayside? Or to say, okay, my life is being lived in the context of a very much wider life of, humans other than humans, the wider planet. How do I reflect that in the story? How do I reflect a different set of values, really, a different kind of cultural mythology, other than the cultural mythology that tells us we must be individualistic and we must want more?
And I guess that would be why a lot of people in their midlife who actually don't give a rat's what other people think can go, no, that's not the story I'm telling. When they get notes like you need to have more of a hero's journey, that they can kind of say phooey to you that this is the story I'm telling and it has relevance.
Yeah, and I think often, stories of situations narratives that look like failures from the perspective of the hero's journey, because the heroine or the hero hasn't gained the world, isn't king of the universe, hasn't cut the heads off a whole bunch of dragons. Those are the ones that much more realistically reflect women's lives as well as many men's lives. And I think there's nothing stopping us from writing stories in that way. Stories, I mean, just to use a very trite example, stories where outwardly somebody appears to have lost everything, a home, a husband, a kind of job, I don't know, whatever it might be that they held dear. But what they've done is that they've gained strength and a new sense of kind of belonging to the wider world associated with that. I mean, it can be as simple as that, just this whole sense that the end point of any good story has to be the acquisition of something, whether it's wealth or status or whatever. It doesn't. It can be the acquisition of something else. It can be the acquisition of community. It can be the acquisition of belonging, of enchantment, a different way of being in the world, a sense of peace. Um,
Mm. Going to turn now to the term mythical misfit, which you've used before, and it feels very familiar to many creatives. Could you explain what you mean by mythical misfit and why embracing our uniqueness matters? I think it's going to tie into what we were just saying, actually.
So this is a phrase that came up when I was thinking about that cultural mythology, and we all live according to cultural myths. We don't think of them like that because they're presented to us just as the way the world is. The world is based on progress. The world is based on more. Our entire economy, for example, here in the West is based on constant growth. And we're presented with that as though, well, of course it's got to be, and nobody kind of questions it. But when the cultural myths of individualism, of progress and growth, when they are failing us and when they are failing the world, I think we can probably agree they are, then when we recognize that and we don't want to live by those myths anymore, when we start questioning those myths, then in a sense we kind of fall out of the cultural myth, if you like. And we become what I think of, or what I kind of termed mythical misfits. We're misfits. We don't fit into the cultural mythology anymore. We're questioning it. And what was interesting when I started really thinking about that is I found some words by Jung. Can't remember exactly which book it was in now, but he was saying that effectively when the cultural mythology fails, then the myth making falls to individuals. So it falls to individuals to kind of create new myths, if you like, or more functional myths. And by that, I don't necessarily mean sitting down in a room and writing new myths, but it can be. I mean, it can start there. It can start with people writing different stories and challenging. But it is about challenging the cultural mythology. So a mythical misfit is someone who just thinks, no, this whole worldview that we have been served up isn't actually serving us at all. So what are we going to do instead? And I think creatives have a huge role to play in that. Be just by writing the different stories that everybody's got to read or watch and look at and think, oh no, that feels better. You don't have to be constantly striving. You don't have to be constantly feeling a sense of failure. What we should be valuing actually are different things: connections, relationality, belonging.
And is that like fairy tales not being static? Is that along the same lines? They can be reimagined, uh, given what is going on. And like you said, we're in a time of enormous upheaval, but there is a natural reimagining going on.
I think that always happens. I mean, really, myths tend to be a little bit more static, precisely because they are kind of from the top down. They are kind of explanatory for how the world is and what our role should be in it. But because fairy tales come from the bottom up, because they are function of the lives of the people and they reflect the lives of kind of ordinary working people. As those lives change and as different challenges are faced, then the stories change. And so you would always find that storytellers would change the story for a different audience depending on what was happening in their world. And that process kind of stopped as we lost the oral tradition. And we have a thing about books in the West, you know? If somebody writes it in a book, it must be true. And therefore you can't change it. And I'm not entirely sure that it's not kind of biblical. You know, there's a Bible, you can't change that now. It's fixed. And as soon as all the men started writing down the fairy tales, it's like, okay, that's it. That's the true story. You know, you mustn't change it. And of course, it's nonsense. And what began to happen in the 70s, particularly, is that a bunch of wonderful feminist writers like Angela Carter and others began to say, okay, look, these fairy tales show women in a certain set of roles, which is still applicable, but women are doing other things now. You know, women have other choices. Women are tired of all this shit, you know, whatever it might be. It's just like, and then they started to say, okay, what would happen if instead of a particular kind of heroine, we placed a more contemporary heroine? And I've done that in my own work. I reimagined some fairy tales in a book called Foxfire Wolfskin and Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women. And it was very much about what would happen if these women were contemporary, if the Snow Queen was a contemporary figure. You know, what would she have to say? Would we, in a world of global warming, would we actually like the Snow Queen? You know, would she no longer be a villain? So I think we might be doing it more in writing now or in film or drama or even dance, compared to the storyteller sitting and telling tales, because we tend not to do that much. But that process is still going on, and it still should go on. And so that's one of the reasons why I find fairy tales so relevant. I'm not seeing them as a kind of fixed, static thing. I'm seeing them as something that changes as we change, and it is infinitely malleable, and it's a shape shifting form, the fairy tale.
And I think you've said before that they kind of arise out of the land and there's like a co-creation. It's like you say, bottom up. And if the land's needing us to tell something different at the moment, and do you need to be really connected to the land? Does that help you personally when you write?
It's always been something that's preoccupied me, kind of in my life as well as in my writing. And I think it's because, you know, we do see is that these stories are not just about one individual protagonist. They're about an individual protagonist in the in context, in situ, in place. And so the nature of the landscape in a fairy tale, in some ways, confines its possibilities or expands its possibilities. You know, things can only happen in snow-filled wastes, for example, like the Snow Queen. And so I've always been interested as a psychologist in the ways in which place and landscape shape us. So there's that, and also the particular communities that you find in particular landscapes, in particular places, inform the nature of the fairy tale. If you look at just Slavic fairy tales, for example, you know, with all of those dark forests, I mean, they have a really big penchant for very dangerous old women, for example, who always live in the woods, and that's kind of a different archetype that keeps rising up in those fairy tales compared to fairy tales that might be set in more kind of bucolic village, you know, English, pretty little English village settings. Its place impacts everything, and it particularly impacts a story. And any fiction writers who are listening to us will know very well that, you know, the setting, the place, is often as big as a kind of human character in any good novel.
And coming from Australia, that is very much informs our storytelling, our books, our myth. We love a good lost in the desert, children going missing, which is also informed by our colonial past as well. So place, I can see why place is so important.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite writers actually is Jeanette Turner Hospital, who's an Australian novelist who wrote some stunning books about displacement and the kind of spookiness of the Australian outback. So it just certain places go with certain ideas, and certain ideas I think are only possible in certain places, or easier, let's say, not possible, but easier in certain places. And so that's true for me. That's true for me with fairy tales. You know, as I said, I work mostly in the European tradition, but if you look around the world at different fairy tales, and again, the kind of the images that arise from them, the archetypal characters that arise from them, they're all in some ways associated with the nature of the place.
And now turning to the divine feminine, which is something you write a lot about. Could you explain what the divine feminine is and how could we reclaim it as a narrative force, not just a spiritual one?
I think for me, my own focus on the divine feminine began at midlife, and again, it was part of this process of just being tired of being fed stories of powerful men and men who mattered, and women always being second class citizens, as we were in the Christian tradition that I was raised in. I mean, I wasn't raised in a very religious tradition, but that was present in the background of everything. With women that created the fall, and women are subject to men, and God is male, and all of the rest of it. And I got rather tired of this, and I won't go into all of the detail, but let's say that at midlife, I decided to look back at my own native mythology to see if there was anything different. I'd been living in America for a while, and I'd read lots of Native American myths and stories about powerful women. And I thought, well, I wonder if we've got any. And to cut a long story short, we did. And certainly in the Irish and British tradition, and the kind of wider Celtic traditions as well of Western Europe, we see that it's actually very female centered, that women, otherworldly women, let's call them, the divine women, are much more active and creative, and they are the mediators between humans and the other world, whatever we might think of the other world as. They're the ones who bring out its gifts. They're the ones who carry the grail. So they have a really very important role to play. And it made me very sad that we had lost that. And that's another reason why I'm so passionate about these old stories, because they do reflect a very old ancestral lineage where women might not always have had as much kind of social power as men, in the sense that they weren't always equal. Although they could be queens, they could be lots of things, but it was sometimes harder. But nevertheless, they were revered for having this particular ability to kind of translate the otherworldly into this world for us. And I think that's relevant in a narrative sense as well, because it just gives us the sense that we're not making this stuff up from scratch. It's always been there. And it's only actually very recently that we haven't had that sense of women as something remarkable and beautiful and, yeah, powerful in the best kinds of ways. And I think that there is a place for looking back at how we once perceived women in our culture, whether it's older women or younger women. At every stage of life, there were women who were really, really interesting and had something to offer. And I think it's about looking at those stories. What were these women doing? They were very closely associated with the land, for example. They were often the land personified. They were the moral force of the other world. They were the kind of moral authority for the people. So how can we weave that back into our narratives? Again, not making it up from scratch, but just saying this is the way it once was. We lost our way. How do we find our way back again to that sense of women um, having that kind of divine association, that divine quality?
And making it important rather than a backstory as well. I feel
Absolutely, yeah.
you've written about wells a lot. Does that tie in any way the significance of wells?
Women in our, again, in our native traditions are very much associated with the land. As I said, they embody the land, they personify the land, but also with the waters. And so there is a huge connection between women and rivers, and women and wells. And so there are lots of stories where we know from our kind of what little threads we have left of our native cosmology that wells were believed to have their origin in the other world. And so, a well was sacred because the water came from the other world. And there's a huge tradition of well maidens, of women who kind of embody that life-giving force of water and that nourishing force of water as well. So yeah, women are very watery in our traditions.
We've got about 15 minutes left. Would you possibly share a version of the Siberian myth, the woman who becomes a fox?
Yeah, I mean, earlier I said that one of the things that happens at midlife is that all of the kind of supporting, or many of the supporting structures kind of fall away from us. And it's a kind of time when one story is left behind and another one begins. And what this story, which is an old Siberian story, kind of encapsulates for me all of the ways in which fairy tales help us to kind of picture what's going on. So this is a story of a woman and a man who've been married for a very long time, and they've grown to midlife together. And every morning for all of their marriage, the man has left the house in the morning and he's come back in the evening. And the wife has no idea, all of these years, no idea what he's been doing. And she gets to midlife, and any midlife woman will recognize she just can't bear it anymore. She can't stand it. She has to know it's not good enough anymore. And so she decides to follow him one morning when he's leaving the house. And she follows him up the village road and out of the village. She follows him into the woods. She follows him into the middle of the woods. She follows him until he arrives at a clearing with a big log in the middle of it. And she watches, hidden, of course, as he sits on that log and sits on that log. And that's what he does all day. And she's just looking at this whole situation thinking, effectively, this is bonkers. I don't know. I don't know. Why am I married to this man? Why am I in this situation? What am I doing? Who am I? She has the whole kind of midlife crisis almost right there and then. And she decides she's off. She's just not having it anymore. And so she goes back home. She puts a few things in her pockets and she sets off. She has no idea where she's going. She just knows that she has to go. Something has to shift. So she sets off along the road and she runs into a giant. And as a giant will, he picks her up and slings her over his shoulder and runs with her up to the top of a mountain where he dumps her in a dark cave and then bugs off. Off he goes. That's it. Not what she had in mind. So she's sitting in this dark cave. It's absolutely freezing. It's Siberia. And she starts to cry. And all of a sudden she hears a voice say, "Don't cry, don't cry, look up. And you'll see the skins of land birds above you." So she looks up and she sees a shelf, and on the shelf is a basket, and she pulls the basket down, and there's a beautiful coat made of crow feathers. So she thinks this is wonderful. She puts it on, but it's too small. It doesn't fit her. So she starts crying again. And then she hears the voice again. "Don't cry, look up, and you'll find the skins of land animals above you." As she looks up, another shelf, another basket, pulls it down. There's a coat made of beautiful red fox skins. So she puts this on, and it does fit. And before she knows it, she's warm and she's feeling brave, and she decides to make her escape before the giant comes back. She trots off down the mountain. She gets halfway down the mountain, stops for a drink in a pool, looks at her reflection in the pool, and discovers that she's grown a pair of russet fox ears. She carries on. Um, and by the time she gets to the bottom of the mountain, she has this sense that there's something behind her, that somebody's following her. So she whips her head around, but what's actually following her is a beautiful snow-tipped russet foxtail, which is on her bum. It's hers. And by the time she gets back to her village again, she is full-on vixen. She has become a fox. And she's looking there, standing there, and she sees her father, who's about to go out fishing in his canoe. And she thinks, "I'll go back to my father's house. I'll go back home. I'll be safe there. It's familiar. I have no idea what's going on here. One minute I'm a woman, now I'm a fox. I've just left my husband. There's a giant and all of the rest of it." And she thinks she'll kind of regroup in her father's house. So she walks up to her father's house and she tries to put her head in through the doorway. But every time that her head tries to get through the doorway, her new fox body whips her back around again and won't let her go in. And so after she's tried this a few times and failed, she decides it's not going to work, and she sets off across the snowy field into whatever story might be awaiting her. So, I mean, clearly this isn't a story about leaving your husband at midlife as the only thing to. I mean, clearly for some women that's what they do, but it's not. That's not the teaching element of this story. The teaching element of this story to me is that something has to be left behind, and it's going to get you one way or another. It's going to get you have to be prepared to transform. And you normally have no clue when you kind of reach midlife and things begin to disintegrate. You have no clue what's going to come in its place, and it's very frightening. But if you allow the transformation to happen, something beautiful will emerge, even if that something beautiful is quite unexpected. And just that whole, what I love about stories is the images. So that whole idea of this woman just becoming a fox, the foxtail, and it's just a beautiful image. And it so perfectly encapsulates just in that image what happens to women at midlife. And that's, to me, the power of a really good fairy tale.
The thing that charms me so much about that story is that it comes from the bottom up.
Yeah, but she opens herself to the possibility by stepping out of the door. Again, as we were talking about earlier, she has to make the step, and she doesn't know what's going to come along. And the other thing that I love about this particular story is that it is transforming into a wild creature. It's transforming into a fox that is part of her new story. And I think that also reflects that kind of embodiedness of the female experience. And, midlife and menopause particularly is a very embodied experience. It's really hard to ignore it. Stuff is breaking left, right, and center. And again, I think that the wild woman kind of archetype is one that really comes knocking at our door at midlife and menopause. That sense of, okay, just let some stuff fall, just let it fall. What's left? What's the core of you? What's that kind of? When I say wildness, I don't mean mad. I mean just embodied wisdom, really, without all of the social trappings that keep us well behaved and confined and what have you. It's just looking for when all that social stuff is stripped away, what's left. For her, it's a fox. What is it for each of us? So it reflects also that big embodied experience that we have at midlife and menopause.
The Dalai Lama, I don't know when it was a few years ago, but he said that the world could possibly be saved by the Western woman. And there's something in this midlife crucible where it's almost like we have the chance and the capacity to reimagine the world's story because we aren't fighting poverty and we have gone through midlife, so we've put on a new skin. So it kind of gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, from my perspective, why I think these stories matter so much now to women is for the same reasons they mattered to me when I was at midlife and just searching for something that made me matter in the world. And Western women, the whole narrative that we are fed is that there's nothing for us here, just we're irrelevant to the ongoing trajectory of the culture. And if we were, all of us, or a lot of us, to grasp the power of those old stories and to see ourselves in these remarkable, beautiful, otherworldly, life giving, sometimes bullshit and difficult and feisty women, then I think everything would change. And I think a lot of the reason why Western women aren't creating a new narrative is because we don't have any sense of belonging properly to the world. And what these stories do for me, and again, I'm talking about those of us who come from a kind of European heritage, they give me a lineage. It's like, no, we were always this. We were always these amazing things. And it's only very recently, as I said, that we've lost sight of it. We need to reclaim those stories. We need that sense of who we can be and why we have always mattered. And the men matter too in the old stories, of course, but often in different ways. And I think that that would change everything. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about them. If Western women as a whole, as a group, realized who we once were and could be again, then I think a lot of things would change for the better.
That's why your work is so important.
Well, thank you. It's what I love. It's what I do.
So my final question, which I'm asking all my guests, is if your storytelling carried the power of the heroine's wand, what would it restore, reimagine, or release into the world?
I think probably some confidence in women that who we are and what we have to say and what we have to be matters. And that confidence that it matters, um, tied up with a sense of change being possible. Because all of these old stories of women, not just the fox woman, but so many of these old stories are about transformation, not just once, but again and again and again. And just when you think you've arrived, here comes another transformation. And that happens to us after menopause as well. There is a sense now that women have thinking, okay, menopause is the last big transformation. It's not. I can promise you that. There's more stuff to come. It might be a little bit gentler, but it's still happening. So that sense of possibility of change being possible and valuable, and that women are the ones who can deliver it. That's what I would like my magic wand to magic into being.
Sharon Blackie, thank you so much for being my guest today. It's been an absolute pleasure. There's so much more to talk about, but thank you.
Thank you for the lovely and thoughtful questions and conversation.
The Storymakers Rebellion is created on the unceded lands of the Bundjalung Nation in New South Wales, Australia. For tens of thousands of years, storytellers have nurtured a kinder, more connected world. Thank you for listening.